not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Dylan Thomas wrote those words anticipating the death of his father. And those words capture something of our cultural attitude. We live in a death-denying culture. We believe and behave as if life must be preserved at literally all cost. We spend a surprising amount of our healthcare budget as a nation trying to prolong the end of life. According to one study, 30% of all Medicare expenditures are attributed to the 5% of beneficiaries that die each year. And a third of that cost occurs during the last month of life. And that makes sense to me. Why wouldn't I give anything to help a loved one in their critical hours? Unfortunately, it turns out that all those interventions may not actually be making dying any easier. In the archives of internal medicine, a study asked if a better quality of death takes place when the per capita costs rise. And the study actually found that the less money is spent in that time period, the better the death experience is for the patient. If all those extra interventions at the end of life aren't making the patient happier, aren't making their death easier, we must be doing those interventions for another reason. I think on some level we believe that it is our duty to fight as long and as hard as we can, as if the value of life is measured in the number of hours or heartbeats, as if longevity were a form of virtue. But as my teacher Don Bassan tells us, death is not a failure. The very fact that we are alive means that someday each of us will die. Let's just take a moment and sit with that truth. How does it make you feel? Sad? Angry? Scared? Peaceful? Perhaps in our culture, there's even a subtle taboo against even thinking or talking about our own very real mortality. As if by thinking about it, we make it so. When I was 5 years old, I remember lying in my bed as my mom, having been awoken by her terrified daughter in the middle of the night, patiently explained that we didn't live near a volcano and that no one in Pennsylvania was going to die in a volcano before morning. Her patient explanation surprisingly did not soothe me, because once you realize deep in your bones that your time is finite, it awakens our most basic human fear. When I was growing up, I had, as one family therapist called it, a precocious sense of my own mortality. And when I was about the age my son Nick is now, I remember writing a will and telling my family that I wanted every intervention, every modern marvel of medicine must be used to keep me alive as long as possible. And I think part of the reason I ended up going to seminary was because this dread of death was keeping me from truly enjoying life. Death seemed too high a cost to pay for living. Fortunately, my very first semester in seminary, I took a class in Buddhism which teaches us that much of the suffering we experience comes from the energy that we spend pushing away, denying, and otherwise trying not to look at our own impermanence and the impermanence of everything under the sun. I began during that class and a practice that I continue to this day. Whenever I think about death now, instead of trying to run from the idea in my own mind, I just slow down, I breathe, and with compassion for myself, I notice those difficult ideas and feelings. And from that compassionate place, I began to wonder, does death have a value of its own? Consider that every death is as unique as every birth, as every person. Dying is the end of every life story, so what if we allowed ourselves to give attention, thought, even grief, to shaping the end of our story? Are we empowered to shape our own death as we shape the rest of our lives? Could we ever feel clear enough to say, enough? Or, this is my time? Could we give our own death as much thought as we would give to moving to a new town or starting a new job? Because I believe in doing so, we might not only make our own death easier for ourselves, but also easier for our loved ones. And we might improve the quality of our living as well. Psychologist Erich Fromm wrote, "To die is poignantly bitter, but the idea of having to die without having lived is unbearable." It's easy to let the ordinary patterns of life carry us inexorably through the years as we wait for our life to begin. But when we remember the reality of our own death, sometimes that can be the shock that wakes us up, that encourages us to begin to live. Maybe it's happened to you that a scary diagnosis, or the death of a loved one, or even a terrifying moment in traffic when you white-knuckle your way out of a crash, has woken up something in you that reminds you what a precious gift life is, and that its brevity only makes it that much more urgent that we live fully and well. This past Friday, the adult religious education class explored the writings of UU minister William Schultz, who said, "I think the great Danish existentialist Søren Kierkegaard had it exactly right when he suggested that fear and trembling are requisite to being a religious person, and that only when we overcome our denial of death are we likely to truly remember existence." So let's take some time this morning to sit in the presence of death, to look deep at ourselves and see what comes up for us as we do. Let's take just a moment here in this safe and loving space to imagine ourselves at the end of our own lives. There's an insert in your order of service. For some people, it's helpful to write things down as they think, and so if you'd like to do that, you can do that on this little piece of paper. There might be pens at the back if you need. As you imagine the end of your own life, what images and feelings come to you? Most of us can't choose the moment or the circumstance of our death, but there are often choices that we can make. Imagine what death you would choose for yourself if you could. I asked my son's permission to share a memory of a time when Nick was about the same age I was when I was worried about those volcanoes. He asked me, inconsolable, what would happen to him if we died. I talked to him about feelings, I talked to him about theology, but ultimately it was when I explained that we had a plan called a will, all written up, that his worries seemed to calm down a bit. I told him that his godmother Suzanne had the plan and would make sure that it all got carried out. And that my sister and her family had agreed to take Nick into their home and raise him like a son, like a brother to his cousins. And I explained about life insurance so that he wouldn't have to worry about money. And he seemed a little comforted. By bravely considering the practical aspects of our own end of life, we have a chance to make a challenging time smoother for our loved ones, and to ease our own worry, as practical planning sometimes does. So let's take another moment now to think about what things we'd like to do to make our own death easier for those that we care about. Community, we also think about how to support the dying process for everyone. For example, in January, the Medical Aid in Dying Act for 2017 it reintroduced in New York State. This is a bill to give New Yorkers the option to make end-of-life healthcare decisions that are right for them in the final stages of a terminal illness. So if there are options that you want in facing your own death, you might consider calling or writing your state representatives and let them know. And there is going to be a handout on the table at coffee hour if you want to learn more about that. And now, finally, I would like to ask you to hold everyone in this room in a spirit of compassion. And in this compassionate space, look back over your life, knowing that it is finite. And notice if there's anything that you feel called to do in your remaining time. To hold your loved ones more closely, to have more fun, to mentor someone younger, to seek forgiveness and reconciliation? Is there anything you might do that would give your life greater wholeness and meaning? We'll pause in another time of reflection. With Mary Oliver, that to live in this world, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing that your own life depends on it. There is a real danger that an awareness of our own mortality could cause us to close our own hearts to all that is mortal, knowing that we're going to lose it. But instead, Oliver counsels us to courage. Loving the impermanent things of life, loving them deeply, is what life is made of. We hold the things we love against our bones, knowing that our life does, in fact, depend on it. This is the only thing that can protect us from dying without ever having lived. Part of the reason that I no longer am beset by my teenage fear of death, well, I mean, I still have a good fear of it, but not that panic that used to follow me around, is because I finally feel like I've lived. I've had adventures, I've made mistakes, I have loved people dearly, I've been helpful where I could. And so I went back to my family and I said I no longer feel like I need every medical intervention that science has invented. And that if I have a chance to die quickly, peacefully, near the people I love, that I would ask them to let me go. That's the other part of Oliver's advice. When the time comes, to let it go. The Buddha taught us that so much of suffering comes from our attachment to things continuing just as they are. Our attachment to things as we want them and as we expect them to be. So at some point we must turn our energy from holding what we love against our bones to letting it go. And if we are lucky, that letting go may have some grace and peace to it. And if we prefer to rage against the dying of the light, that is our choice too. But either way, let's bring as much consciousness, as much compassion as we can muster to our moments of loss and transition, because they're an important part of life. And so as difficult as it is even to consider our own mortality, I believe it's one of the most important parts of the spiritual journey. And one of the most important parts of being a beloved community is sharing these questions and concerns with one another. should know what you want and what you value. We, your beloved community, want to support you and be present for you in the whole of our lives together, including all the complexity and intensity of our dying. A couple of years ago, we had a class called Ending Well, where we had an opportunity to talk together about these difficult questions, and I will make the same deal with you that I made with that class. If you think of something you want to do to prepare for the end of your life, we want to help. And so if you create a will or what do we call it here? It's on the handout. Advance directive. If you create an advance directive or a will, or even just have a difficult conversation, if you need something needs witnessing, a lot of these things need 2 or 3 witnesses, bring them to coffee hour. We'll have like a witnessing party at coffee hour. If you come up with a goal this morning that you're going to have a difficult conversation with your children, with your parents, with your partner, if you decide you want to fill out an advance directive, there's a whole bunch of useful links on the back of this handout, and I've printed out, for those of you who don't feel super comfortable on the computer, the difficult conversation starter kit. This will be available at coffee hour. If you do any of those goals that you create for yourself, I will personally bake you a dozen cookies. That's my deal. Because death is not a failure. Not our own death, and not the death of our loved ones. Death is an important part of life. It is the last chapter in each wonderful, adventurous story. And when we deny death, we miss the chance to make choices and decisions that will affect us and our loved ones. We miss the chance to grieve and to rage and to find peace. We miss the wake-up call that death brings, reminding us how precious is this very moment. How precious is the life of every being. Let this be a community where together we bravely shine the light of consciousness on our own mortality and ask together, knowing that each must die, how then shall we live? May it be so. Let's sing together